Josephine Vance had always known the land would shape her fate. Its red dust was in the very marrow of her bones. Its relentless sun the first thing she saw each morning. But nothing in her 17 years of quiet observation could have prepared her for the day the wind changed. And the world she knew, a world built on power, ritual, and fear, began to unravel. The Vance Dominion was more than a cattle ranch. It was an empire etched onto the face of the West. Its territory sprawled across 3 counties. Its herds numbered in the tens of thousands. And the nearby town of Red Creek was its vassal state, its prosperity tethered completely to the will of one man, her father. Bartholomew the Baron Vance, he was a monolith of ambition. A man who had carved this kingdom from the wilderness with a will of iron and a heart that pumped inscrutable pride instead of blood. His shadow was long, stretching over every soul in the valley, and most heavily of all, it fell upon the quiet, sheltered life of his only child. That quietness was a foreign seed in the harsh soil of the Dominion, a legacy from her mother, a woman from the cultured East who had tried to cultivate poetry and violins in a land that understood only the language of branding irons and Colt revolvers. She had wilted under the merciless sun and her husband's even more merciless will. Passing from a lung fever when Josie was just a child, she left behind 2 things: a daughter who was the living image of her gentle, contemplative spirit, and a library of leather-bound books that became Josie's only true home. To the Baron, Josie's love for these books was a galling weakness. He saw her immersion in stories of distant lands and forgotten histories, not as intellectual curiosity, but as a retreat from the hard, tangible reality he had conquered. He despised it because it reminded him of his late wife, the one beautiful, delicate thing he had owned but could never truly command. In his daughter's soft hands and thoughtful gaze, he saw a genetic stain of that same fragility, a flaw in the dynasty he intended to forge. The breaking point, simmering for years, finally boiled over on a sweltering Tuesday. The occasion was a dinner, but it was, in reality, a transaction designed to seal a dynasty. The suitor was Sterling Prescott, the sole heir to a silver mining empire, a man whose polished manners were a thin veneer over a core of cold, calculating ambition. The air in the grand dining room, usually cool and still, was thick with the oppressive weight of unspoken negotiations. Josie sat encased in a corset that felt like a cage of bone. The fine silk of her gown, a costume for a role she felt wholly unprepared to play. She listened as her father and Prescott discussed cattle futures, railroad expansions, and territorial politics. Their conversation a verbal chess match where she was the unspoken prize. She felt Sterling's gaze sweep over her, not with desire or even curiosity, but with the cool, dispassionate disinterest of an auctioneer assessing flawed livestock. Later, in the parlor, as the men swirled brandy in heavy crystal glasses, the final judgment was passed. A remarkable domain you've carved out, Baron, Sterling began, his voice as smooth as oil leather. A testament to vision and strength. A man could build an empire upon such foundations. He paused, letting the compliments settle before his eyes drifted towards Josie, who sat by the unlit fireplace, a silent fixture in the room. An empire like this, he continued, a faint, crude smile playing on his lips, needs a fortress at its side, a queen of equal steel to guard its gates. What you offer is a beautiful, unopened garden. The soil is rich, perhaps, but it requires years of careful cultivation, time and effort to make it bloom. And I, as you know, am an impatient man of industry. I have no time for gardening. The insult, wrapped in the silk of metaphor, was a blade that slid between her ribs, quiet, devastating, and utterly public. It was a dismissal not of her appearance, but of her very soul. The heavy silence that followed was broken not by a roar of anger, but by the Baron's low, dangerous chuckle, the sound of a glacier cracking. His rage was never hot. It was a chilling, immense pressure that froze everything around it. After Sterling's departure, he turned to Josie, his eyes devoid of any warmth. "So," he spoke, his voice barely a whisper, a sound more terrifying than any shout. "You are uncultivated land, a garden that needs a stronger hand than mine. It seems." He stared at her for a long moment, as if she were a piece of faulty machinery he was deciding how to discard. "Then you shall learn what it is to work the earth until your hands are as coarse as your spirit is supposed to be." He strode to the door and barked a single, sharp order. Minutes later, Silas was brought before them. He was a tall, lean man whose presence seemed to absorb the room's tension. He was an ex-prospector from the Grizzly Peaks, a man who had lost a lifetime of work to a crooked claim jumper and was now bound to the Baron by a debt he could never hope to repay. He stood before the opulence of the parlor, his clothes stained with the red dust of the Dominion, his face a stony, unreadable mask. He did not look at the Baron or at Josie. His gaze was fixed on a point on the floor, his stillness that of a man who had learned to endure by making himself as small and unnoticeable as possible. The Baron addressed the room, his voice ringing with the cold finality of a judge passing sentence. "As of this moment, the name Vance is no longer yours to bear. Your mother's weakness dies with you tonight. You are disowned." He then turned his chilling gaze to Silas. "Your debt to me is considerable. I am now prepared to consider it paid in full. You will take this burden off my hands. She will live in the bunkhouse with the other hands. You will be responsible for her. You will see that she works." It was a masterstroke of cruelty, a public execution of her identity framed as a simple business transaction. She was no longer a daughter being punished. She was a debt being settled, an object being transferred. The walk from the manor to the bunkhouse was a funeral procession for the life she had known. As she passed, the ranch hands in the yard felt silent, their eyes quickly averting to the ground, their fear of the Baron a palpable force that smothered any potential pity. The scent of her mother's roses in the manicured garden gave way to the raw, pungent smell of sweat, manure, and cheap tobacco. Silas held the rough-hewn door of the bunkhouse open, his face as impassive as stone. The stench from within, of unwashed bodies and damp wool, hit her like a physical blow. Inside, the long, low-ceilinged room was filled with the weary presence of tired men, rows of simple cots, each a small island of private misery, lined the walls. Josie stood in the center of the room, a ghost in fine silk, her very presence a violation of this stark masculine world. Silas moved to the furthest, darkest corner, gesturing to an empty cot with its thin, lumpy mattress. He then turned away, granting her the small, final mercy of not watching her world completely collapse. She stood there, trembling, every nerve screaming, every instinct telling her to run, but there was nowhere to run to. From outside, she heard the heavy main door being pushed shut, and then the sharp, grating sound of a heavy iron bolt sliding home. It was the final metallic note in a symphony of her downfall. The kingdom she had once inhabited, however unhappily, had shrunk to the four suffocating walls of this room. Her fate now rested entirely in the hands of a silent, indebted stranger. A man who seemed as haunted and unforgiving as the red dust that had finally, truly, claimed her The first night in the bunkhouse was a lesson in textures and sounds. Josie lay rigid atop the thin, lumpy mattress, the coarse wool of the blanket scratching against the delicate silk of her ruined gown, a final, mocking touch from a world that no longer existed. Sleep was an impossible luxury. Her mind, accustomed to the hushed quiet of the manor, was besieged by the symphony of masculine exhaustion, the wet, heavy snores of one man, the sharp, hacking cough of another, the low, mournful murmur of someone lost in a troubled dream. Every sound was an affirmation of her exile. Beside her, the absolute stillness of Silas was its own form of noise. It was a void, a pocket of silence so dense it felt heavier than all the other sounds combined. And she found herself listening to his even, almost imperceptible breathing, as a sailor might watch a distant, unreadable star. Dawn arrived not as a gentle promise, but as a harsh, gray command. The men rose and moved with a grim, practiced efficiency, their world governed by the sun and the bell. Josie's presence was a disruption they navigated with a sort of weary indifference. Her first assigned task was to slop the pigs, a chore so viscerally disgusting it sent waves of nausea through her. She stumbled at the heavy bucket, spilling the foul-smelling contents on her dress, the stench clinging to her like a second skin. Later, she was tasked with mending fences, but her soft hands, which knew only the weight of a book, fumbled with the heavy tools. The wire coiled back on her, scratching her arms, and her attempts to hammer a staple were clumsy and ineffective, earning a few contemptuous snorts from the passing hands. Each failure was a fresh wave of humiliation, a confirmation of the words Sterling Prescott had used: uncultivated land. She ate nothing that first day, her throat too tight with shame and despair to swallow. That evening, as she sat on the edge of her cot, fighting back tears of utter frustration, she saw Silas approach. He didn't look at her. He simply placed a tin plate on the dusty crate beside her bed. On it sat a chunk of dark bread and a ladle of thick bean stew. He then retreated to his own corner without a word. Josie stared at the plate. Her first instinct, born of a lifetime of caution, was suspicion. But then the rich, savory smell reached her, and a hunger so deep it was painful twisted in her stomach. Pride warred with necessity, and necessity won. The stew was simple, almost bland. But to Josie, it was the most exquisite meal she had ever tasted. It was a silent acknowledgement of her humanity, a gesture that said, "I see you are hungry." This became their ritual. He never told her to eat. The plate would simply appear. He never told her how to work. He would simply do a task correctly after she had failed, allowing her to learn through observation. One afternoon, he found her struggling to soothe her blistered hands in the cool water of the creek. He disappeared into the brush and returned with broad, green comfrey leaves. He crushed them methodically between two stones and offered the fragrant pulp to her with a single gruff word, "Here." The cool relief was immediate, a balm not just for her skin, but for her frayed spirit. These wordless lessons became the foundation of her survival. She learned to identify the scent of an approaching rainstorm, to braid rope from stray twine, to listen to the rhythm of the ranch instead of fighting against it. Her fascination with Silas deepened. He was a man of ghosts, she realized. Sometimes, when he thought no one was watching, she would see him pull a small, worn, tintype photograph from his satchel. He would gaze at it for a long time, his thumb tracing the faded images of a smiling woman and a small child, his face a mask of such profound sorrow that it made Josie's own heart ache. He would then put it away as if it burned his fingers, his silence returning, heavier than before. On other nights, by the fire, he would take out a piece of pine wood and a small knife and carve, his hands so strong and calloused, moved with an artist's delicacy. She watched him carve a series of small, exquisite animals, a deer, a fox, and, most often, a small wren with its wings spread wide. They were talismans of a lost world, and she knew better than to ask about them. A status as the fallen princess made her a target for the meaner spirits on the ranch. A burly, thoughtless man named Finn took particular pleasure in her struggles. "Still playing house, are we?" He'd sneer as she tried to gather eggs without startling the hens. One evening, as Finn began another tirade, Silas, who was sitting nearby, simply stopped eating. He didn't look up, didn't speak. He just went still, his hand holding a piece of bread halfway to his mouth. The sudden cessation of movement was more powerful than any threat. The air grew cold. Finn's voice faltered, the bravado draining from his face under the weight of that absolute, unnerving stillness. He mumbled an excuse and walked away. Silas resumed his meal as if nothing had happened. He had never laid a hand on Finn, yet he had utterly defeated him. The ultimate confrontation, however, came from Harker, the pompous ranch overseer. He saw Silas's quiet dignity as a personal affront and Josie's defense of him as an unforgivable act of rebellion. He waited for his moment, and it came on a day when a valuable branding iron went missing. Harker stormed into the yard, making a great show of his search, before stopping dramatically in front of Silas. "Empty your pockets, prospector," he demanded. "I'll not have thieves on this ranch." Silas met his gaze calmly. "I have nothing of yours." "We'll see about that," Harker snarled, gesturing to two of his cronies. A taste of the lash usually loosens a man's memory. Tie him to the post. A cold dread washed over Josie, but this time it was mixed with a hot, unfamiliar surge of indignation. She stepped forward, her hand instinctively going to the small, leather-bound book of Dominion laws she had managed to slip into her dress pocket on the day she was cast out. "Stop," she said. Her voice was quiet, but it cut through the tense air. Harker rounded on her. "You again get back to the scullery before I decide you need a lesson as well." "You would be breaking my father's law," Josie said, her voice gaining a surprising firmness. She opened the book, her finger tracing a line she had read a dozen times. Ordinance 11, Section 2. Any punishment to be administered to an indentured laborer must be witnessed and signed off by the landowner or his legally appointed foreman. You are neither. Harker. You are merely an overseer. Harker's face flushed a deep, mottled purple. "I act on the Baron's authority." "Then you require his signature," Josie countered, her gaze unwavering. "And as he is unavailable, your authority is void." Just as Harker was about to explode in fury, another voice, dry and cracked as the earth itself, spoke up. "The girl's right." It was Patch, the oldest hand on the ranch, a man who had seen seasons and overseers come and go. He spat a stream of tobacco juice. "The Baron put that rule in after you nearly killed that stable boy last spring. Harker, he doesn't like loose ends." The public confirmation from one of their own was the final blow. Harker stood defeated, his power evaporating under the steady gaze of a disgraced girl, a silent man, and the collective memory of the crew he sought to control. He backed away, his threats dissolving into empty mutters. That night, the atmosphere by the fire was transformed. The men looked at Josie with a new awareness. She was no longer just a curiosity. She was a force. When the others had retired, leaving only the two of them in the flickering light. Silas finally spoke. He reached into a satchel and pulled out the small carved wren, placing it gently in her hand. "Her name was Lily," he said, his voice soft with memory. "She would have liked you." And then, as if a dam had finally broken, he told her everything. He spoke of his wife, Elspeth, and the way her eyes would shine when she looked at the mountains. He spoke of the fever, the crooked speculator, the crushing weight of a grief so vast it had consumed his words. He spoke not seeking pity, but offering a truth, a gift of trust in return for her courage. Josie listened, her heart swelling with a profound empathy. She understood that she had not just saved him from a whipping, she had given him a reason to speak again. As she curled up on her cot that night, clutching the small, smooth bird in her hand, she knew that the unspoken vow between them was now unbreakable. They were two solitary souls who had found in each other an unexpected sanctuary, a silent promise to face the unforgiving world together. The fragile peace that settled over the bunkhouse was a tangible thing, woven from shared silence and quiet acts of service. It was a peace Josie learned to measure in small, significant moments. It was in the way Silas would leave a freshly sharpened knife by the woodpile when he knew she would be tasked with carving kindling, or how she, in turn, would ensure a bucket of clean water was waiting for him after a long day's ride. Their partnership culminated one rain-soaked afternoon when a newborn calf, separated from its mother, became hopelessly mired in the thick, sucking mud of a rain-swollen creek bed. The other hands had deemed it a lost cause. But Josie, remembering a diagram of levers and fulcrums from one of her father's engineering books, devised a plan. She directed the men, her voice clear and surprisingly steady, while Silas provided the raw, patient strength, working a series of ropes and planks until, with a great collective heave, the calf was pulled free. In that moment, covered in mud but flushed with an unfamiliar sense of accomplishment, she felt a belonging forged not of blood, but of competence and mutual effort. This delicate new world shattered on a blistering afternoon in late summer. A lone rider, his horse a frantic plume of red dust, galloped into the Dominion with the desperate urgency of a man outrunning death itself. He slid from his heaving mount, shouting for the foreman, Miller. A strange stillness fell as the news spread in hushed, disbelieving whispers. Bartholomew the Baron Vance was dead. He had been found at the bottom of the rocky bluffs overlooking Red Creek, his neck broken, his prized stallion standing vigil beside the body. He had died as he had lived, drunk, arrogant, and in a moment of reckless overconfidence. The foreman approached Josie with a new, awkward deference, as if seeing her for the first time as something other than an outcast. "Miss Vance?" he stammered, twisting his hat in his hands. "With the Baron gone, I suppose the Dominion is yours." The words hung in the air, unreal and meaningless. Josie excused herself and walked to the solitude of the creek bed, the same spot where she had once soothed her blistered hands. She felt no triumph, no relief, only a vast, hollow emptiness. She tried to grieve, tried to summon a single, fond memory of her father. But all that came were images of his cold disappointment and a voice that had only ever spoken to her in commands or criticisms. A sharp, bitter guilt pricked at her not for his death, but for her own heart's silence. She was finally, irrevocably, an orphan. And in the terrifying quiet of that realization, a single thought took root. I am free. Her freedom was a fleeting, two-day illusion. They arrived at dusk, 5 riders cloaked in the long shadows of the setting sun. They were not of this land. They wore fine, black city coats, their boots impossibly clean, their movements imbued with a disciplined, predatory grace. At their head rode a man whose serene smile was a chilling contradiction to the cold, dead light in his eyes. He introduced himself to the nervous foreman as Jedediah Kane. His gaze swept over the ranch, not with the curiosity of a visitor, but with the cold appraisal of a man taking inventory of a new acquisition. A message was sent. Mr. Kane requested the presence of the Vance heir in the main house. Returning to the manor was a suffocating experience. The air inside was stale, with the lingering scent of her father's cigars and expensive whiskey. It was the smell of power and decay. Kane was waiting in the great study, standing behind the oak desk as if he were its master. He was appallingly polite. Silas stood behind her, a silent pillar of support near the door, his hand resting on the hatchet tucked into his belt. His presence was the only thing keeping Josie from dissolving into pure terror. "Miss Vance," Kane began, his voice a silken purr. "A tragedy? Your father's passing? I knew him as a man of grand appetites and even grander risks." He gestured for her to sit, though he remained standing. "I represent the Blackwood Syndicate. We were your father's last business partners, and he died owing us a significant debt." Kane let the words settle before continuing, his voice taking on the intimate tone of a storyteller sharing a dark secret. "Perhaps you'd be interested to know how he spent his final hours. It was a poker game in a private room in San Francisco, a game of titans. The Baron was losing, but his pride would not let him fold. He bet his land, his water rights, his herds, all of it. And when his tangible assets were gone, he did something remarkable. He wagered a ghost, an idea, a promise." From his coat, Kane produced a sheaf of papers, bound in ribbon. He laid it on the desk, his manicured finger tapping the wax seal. He called it the ironclad betrothal clause, a rather creative piece of legal maneuvering. He wagered the single most valuable asset he had left that was not yet on the table, the marriage contract for his sole and legitimate heir. Josie felt the air leave her body in a single, silent gasp. The room seemed to shrink, the walls closing in. This was not a business transaction. This was a dissection of her father's final, pathetic moments. And she was the main exhibit. "He lost, of course," Kane said with a theatrical sigh. "He was a desperate man, playing against patient ones, by the laws of this territory. This contract is as binding as any deed or title. You, Miss Vance, are the final settlement, the property that clears your father's ledger." He made a small gesture, and two of his men stepped forward, but a solid form moved to block their path. Silas. He had moved from the doorway to stand directly in front of Josie, his body a living shield. His face was impassive, but his eyes, fixed on Kane, held a contained inferno. Kane's smile tightened. "And what is this?" "The loyal hound, come to protect the last scrap from the master's table." "This is a legal matter. Ranch hand, it does not concern you." "She is not a scrap," Silas said, his voice low, each word resonating with a dangerous calm. "And she is not property." "Oh, a fatal error in judgment," Kane whispered, and his men's hands dropped to their holstered pistols. The air was thick with the promise of death. In that instant, Josie saw Silas's body jerking as the bullets hit, saw him fall to protect her. The vision was so clear, so horrifying, it galvanized her. She would not be the cause of his death. She would not be a passive prize in this monstrous game. With a strangled cry, she surged from her chispar and grabbed Silas's arm. "No, we run! Silas, we run now!" He looked down at her, and in her eyes he saw not a terrified girl, but a fierce ally choosing battle over surrender. He nodded once, with a guttural roar that seemed to come from the very earth. He seized the corners of the massive oak desk and heaved. The desk, weighing hundreds of pounds, scraped across the floor and crashed into Kane's men, sending them staggering backward. It also collided with a tall side table, toppling a heavy, ornate oil lamp. The glass globe shattered, spilling kerosene across the priceless rug. The still burning wick met the fuel, and with a whoosh, a wall of brilliant, hungry flame erupted, bisecting the room. Shouts of shock and anger filled the air. "Get the girl," Kane bellowed, his composure finally breaking. Through the thick, acrid smoke, Josie and Silas fled. They ran through the familiar halls, past portraits of ancestors whose legacy had just been burnt to ash, and burst out into the cool, clean air of the night. The yard was in chaos, men running towards the burning manor. They didn't hesitate. They sprinted for the stables, the smell of smoke spooking the horses. With trembling, frantic hands, they managed to saddle 2 mounts, fighting the panicked animals. As they swung into the saddles, they could hear Kane's men emerging from the house, their shouts cutting through from the crackle of the flames, spurring their horses into a desperate, flying gallop. They rode hard and fast, away from the fire, away from the past, and into the vast, star-dusted darkness of the unknown. They were fugitives now, 2 sparks of defiance fleeing a world in flames. The world beyond the burning Vance Dominion was a vast, unforgiving canvas of rock and sky. They rode into it not as travelers, but as prey. The frantic drumming of their horses' hooves, a desperate prayer against the coming dawn. Just before they had fled the stables, in a moment of sharp, crystalline clarity, Josie had acted. While Silas fought to saddle their panicked mounts, she had spotted a horse she recognized, a sturdy mare with her Aunt Matilda's distinctive brand, a horse her father had acquired in a trade years ago. With trembling fingers, Josie had untied the small silver locket her mother had given her, the only true remnant of her past, and secured it tightly to the mare's bridle. With a desperate plea and a slap on its flank, she had sent the animal galloping east, towards the distant hope of Hayes's overlook. A message without words entrusted to the wind and an animal's instinct to return home. Now, that single act of foresight was their only prayer. For 3 days they rode, pushing their horses and themselves to the ragged edge of endurance. The landscape shifted from rolling plains to a labyrinth of arid canyons and sun-scorched badlands, a place where the earth itself seemed hostile to life. The sun was a hammer. The nights were a deceptive, biting cold. They shared a single canteen of water and a few strips of dried meat Silas had the presence of mind to grab. The pursuit was relentless. They never saw them clearly, but they felt them. A glimpse of dust on a distant ridge, the dislodged pebble clattering down a canyon wall. The unnerving sense of being watched by cold, patient eyes. Jedediah Kane was not merely chasing them. He was herding them, using the terrain as his weapon, funneling them towards a destination of his own choosing. On the 4th day, exhausted and nearly out of water, they found themselves forced into a narrow box canyon. The towering red rock walls on either side seemed to lean in, suffocating them. The sky reduced to a sliver of brilliant, indifferent blue. It was a dead end, a perfect trap. As this realization dawned, a sound echoed from the cliffs above the shop, unmistakable scrape of metal on rock, followed by a low rumble that grew into a deafening roar. Looking up, they saw them, Kane's men, dark silhouettes against the sky, using long iron bars to pry massive boulders loose. The canyon walls began to shed their skin, an avalanche of rock and dust thundering down towards them. Their only chance was a dark, jagged opening in the canyon wall, ahead the abandoned maw of an old silver mine. With a shared, desperate look, they spurred their horses forward, diving into the darkness just as tons of rock crashed down behind them, the impact shaking the very foundations of the mountain and sealing the entrance in a tomb of absolute blackness. The silence that followed the roar was more terrifying than the noise itself. It was a thick, suffocating silence, heavy with the smell of damp earth, cold stone, and something else, a faint, cloying scent of human misery. The darkness was total, a physical presence that pressed in on them. Silas struck one of his precious few matches. The sudden flare of light was blinding, revealing a rough-hewn tunnel supported by rotting timbers. But it also revealed more. In the flickering, dying light of the match, they saw faces, dozens of them, huddled against the tunnel walls, their eyes wide and hollow in the sudden glare. They were gaunt, filthy, and draped in rags, men, women, and even children, their spirits seemingly as broken as the rotting beams above them. As the match died, plunging them back into darkness, a woman's voice, thin and brittle as dry leaves, spoke from the gloom. More wretches for the patriarch's collection. Silas struck another match. It illuminated the speaker. An older woman with a face like a road map of sorrow. Her name, they learned, was Esther. She and the others were homesteaders, debtors, and travelers who had fallen afoul of the Blackwood syndicate. They had been captured and forced into slavery, working the last, depleted veins of the abandoned mine for a pittance of silver. Their lives measured in the dim glow of lanterns and the crack of the overseer's whip. "There is no escape from this place," Esther whispered, her voice devoid of hope. "This mountain is our grave." Despair was a contagion, and it spread quickly through the darkness. Josie felt its cold tendrils wrapping around her own heart. She had run from one cage only to find herself in a larger, darker one. She looked at the hopeless faces around her, at the children clinging to their mothers, and saw her own fate reflected in their empty eyes. But then, she felt the small, smooth weight of the wren Silas had carved for her in her pocket. She thought of his quiet strength, of the defiant spark that had led them here. Something inside her, a core of resilience she never knew she possessed, refused to be extinguished. She would not let this mountain be her grave. "No," Josie said, her voice cutting through the despairing silence. It wasn't loud, but it held a new, unyielding authority. Silas lit a makeshift torch from a piece of oily rag and a splintered timber, casting a warm, defiant glow over the scene. All eyes turned to Josie. "My father threw me away because he thought I was weak," she said, looking from one face to another. "The world has told all of you that you are worthless, that you are disposable. They are wrong." She took a step forward, her gaze sweeping over the captives. "They buried us in this mountain, but they made a mistake. They buried seeds." A flicker of something not yet hope, but a defiant curiosity stirred in the crowd. "Look at us," she continued, her voice rising with a passion she didn't know she had. "We are farmers who know the earth. We are miners who know the stone. We are mothers and fathers who know how to fight for our children. Down here, in the dark, we are not their slaves. We are an army." Esther shook her head. "They have guns," They guard the only other known exit.
Then we will find a new one.
Silas's deep voice rumbled beside her, a steady anchor to her fiery words.
I've prospected in mountains like this.
These old mines are a labyrinth. There is always another way out. It was a choice, made in the heart of the earth, not just to survive, but to lead. Josie, the girl who once hid in books, now stood before a broken people and offered them not a guarantee of safety, but a chance at freedom, however slim. The spark she had ignited was fanned into a flame. With Silas's knowledge of the tunnels and Josie's newfound ability to inspire, they organized the prisoners into a desperate, makeshift army. They armed themselves with sharpened mining tools, pickaxes, shovels, heavy iron bars. Their exodus began, a slow, tense procession through the suffocating darkness, their path lit by a few sputtering torches. The tunnels were a treacherous maze of collapsing passages and hidden chasms. Silas led the way, his instincts as a prospector guiding them through the forgotten veins of the mountain. But Cain was not a man to be underestimated. As they navigated a large, open cavern, they were ambushed. Figures emerged from the side tunnels, Cain's well-armed guards. The battle was a brutal, chaotic explosion of violence in the confined space. The clang of pickaxes against rifle butts, the grunts of exertion, the sharp cries of pain echoed off the cavern walls. It was a desperate, primal struggle of brute force and raw courage against disciplined firepower. Men and women who had not fought in years now did so with the fury of cornered animals. Their makeshift weapons wielded with deadly intent. Despite their ferocious courage, they were being driven back, their numbers dwindling under the steady fire of the guards. They were cornered in a large, dead-end cavern, the fight turning into a last, hopeless stand. Just as despair began to set in once more, a new sound ripped through the chaos, the sharp crack of different rifles, coming from the tunnels behind Cain's men. A wave of confusion rippled through the guards, and then, from the darkness, a new force emerged. It was a rugged posse of homesteaders and freelance miners, their faces grim with determination, led by a tall, silver-haired woman with a rifle held as if it were an extension of her own arm. It was Mattie Hayes. The locket had reached her. The tide of the battle turned instantly, caught between the furious captives and the fresh, well-aimed fire of the rescuers. Cain's forces crumbled. In the midst of the chaos, Josie saw Cain, his handsome face twisted in a snarl of disbelief and fury as his perfect plan disintegrated. He found himself isolated, his men falling or fleeing. His eyes met Silas's across the cavern, a look of pure, distilled hatred passing between them. With a roar, Silas charged, and Cain, drawing a long, wicked-looking knife, met him head-on. Their duel was not a thing of grace, but of brutal, desperate violence. It was a collision of two opposing forces, Cain's cruel, city-bred technique against Silas's raw, untamed strength born of surviving in the wild. They crashed against the rock walls, the ring of knife against hatchet echoing like a death knell. It ended with a final, desperate lunge from Cain, a move Silas sidestepped, using his opponent's own momentum to drive him into a jagged rock formation. As the last of the fighting subsided, a stunned silence descended upon the cavern, broken only by the groans of the wounded and the ragged breathing of the survivors. Mattie Hayes strode through the aftermath, her sharp eyes taking in the scene before finally landing on Josie. For a moment, the two women, aunt and niece, strangers bound by blood, simply looked at each other. Then, Mattie gave a slow, approving nod. The battle was won. Josie looked around at the faces of the people she had helped lead from the darkness, bloody, exhausted, but alive, and, for the first time, free. They emerged, blinking, from the mouth of the mine into the cool, gentle light of a new dawn, a small battered army reborn from the depths of the earth. The journey from the mouth of the mine was a purgatory of exhaustion and grief. They were a battered flock, blinking in a dawn that felt both miraculous and cruel. It was Mattie Hayes who forged them into a column, her quiet authority a balm on their shattered nerves. She led them not towards her own ranch, which would be the syndicate's first target, but south, into a forgotten labyrinth of canyons. After a day and a night of arduous travel, she brought them to a fissure in a rock wall, a hidden entrance to a valley that was a secret sanctuary. A spring fed a lush meadow, enclosed on three sides by towering red cliffs, a natural fortress. As the survivors stumbled into this hidden haven, a collective sigh of relief seemed to ripple through them. They had been running for so long, and they had finally found a place to stop. Esther, the old woman from the mine, whose voice was no longer brittle with despair, named it Hope's Landing. The first days were a blur of tending to the living and honoring the dead. They held a solemn burial beneath a solitary cottonwood tree. Each stone placed on the graves a silent promise to remember. The immediate, pressing reality was survival. The wound in Silas's shoulder, inflicted by Cain's boot knife, was deep and had begun to fester. A dangerous fever took hold, plunging him into a delirium where he murmured the names of his lost wife and daughter. Josie refused to leave his side, drawing on her book knowledge and Mattie's grim, practical wisdom. She fought the infection relentlessly. She kept the wound clean with boiled water and salt, brought from a small cache Mattie had hidden in the valley years ago. She brewed a bitter tea from willow bark to fight the fever and used the last of their salvage cloth for clean bandages. For 3 days, he hovered on the precipice of death. In the long, quiet hours of her vigil, watching the rise and fall of his fevered chest, Josie finally confronted the true depth of her feelings. It was not just the fear of losing an ally, but the terrifying, hollow prospect of losing the very anchor of her new soul. As Silas slowly, arduously began to heal, so too did the community. Hope's Landing began to transform from a refugee camp into a settlement. It was a slow, back-breaking process, marked by the constant gnawing fear of scarcity and the coming winter. That first winter was brutal. The cold seeped through their makeshift shelters, and the hunt for game in the sparse wilderness became a daily struggle for existence. Yet, in this crucible of hardship, their community was forged. Mattie organized the rationing and construction with an iron will. Silas, once recovered, taught them the secrets of the land, how to read animal tracks, which plants were edible, and how to build smokeless fires that wouldn't betray their location. And Josie became their chronicler, their planner, their heart. With her literacy, she created a roster for guard duty, an inventory of their meager supplies, and began teaching the children their letters, scratching symbols in the dirt with a stick. Each night, the entire settlement would gather around a large, central fire, a defiant beacon of warmth and light against the vast, cold darkness. It was here that the true healing took place. Men who had been broken by forced labor spoke of the farms they had once owned. Women who had seen their families torn apart shared stories of their children. They talked of their nightmares. And in sharing them, they drew out the poison of trauma, transforming individual pain into collective resilience. They were no longer a random assortment of victims. They were a clan, a found family woven together by the threads of shared loss and a stubborn refusal to be erased. In the fragile peace of their shared survival, the bond between Josie and Silas evolved. The frantic desperation of their escape was replaced by a deep, quiet intimacy. The long conversations of the heart took place not in words, but in shared tasks and small gestures. It was in the way he would leave a perfectly carved, smooth handle for a tool he knew she would be using, or the way she would save him the last of the hot broth after a long patrol in the cold. One evening, as they stood on a ledge overlooking their small sleeping valley, the sky a breathtaking tapestry of stars, he finally took her hand, his calloused fingers intertwined with hers, a simple, solid connection that spoke of home, of future, of a love that had grown not in the soft soil of a garden, but in the harsh, fertile ground of a shared wilderness. "We build this," he murmured, his voice low. She leaned her head against his good shoulder. Together. Their sanctuary was inevitably tested. A lookout spotted them, 4 riders, their gear bearing the tarnished insignia of the Blackwood Syndicate. They were a scouting party, sweeping the territory for any sign of the survivors. A ripple of the old, familiar fear went through the camp, but it was quickly replaced by a cold, hard resolve. Matty's riflemen took up their hidden positions along the canyon rim, but Silas had a different plan. "We don't have to kill them," he said at the council fire that night. "We just have to make them believe that trying to kill us would be suicide." They spent the next day turning their home into an elaborate trap, following Silas's designs. They rigged deadfall snares, nets filled with rocks, and tripwires that would cause deafening noise. When the scouts cautiously entered the narrow fissure leading into the valley, the community was ready. On Matty's signal, a series of small controlled rock slides, triggered by levers from above, blocked the path behind them, trapping them in the narrow entrance. From a dozen hidden positions, the people of Hope's Landing let out ferocious, echoing cries, the sound magnified by the canyon walls to sound like a force of hundreds. Confused and unnerved, the scouts drew their weapons. Before they could fire wildly into the canyon, a single shot rang out. It was from Matty's rifle. The bullet didn't hit a man. It struck a rock just inches from the lead scout's head, showering his face with stone splinters. The message was clear, precise, and terrifying. "We see you. We can kill you any time we want." The scouts, faced with a blocked retreat, an unseen enemy of unknown numbers, and the evidence of an expert marksman, made a tactical decision. This was not a camp of helpless survivors. This was a defended, fortified position. After a tense standoff, they slowly, carefully backed their horses out of the trap and retreated into the wilderness. That night, the celebration around the fire was not loud or boastful. It was a deep, resonant joy, the relief of a people who had defended their home on their own terms. They had met the threat not with panicked violence, but with cleverness, unity, and strength. They were not victims cowering in a hole. They were founders in their fortress. As Josie stood beside Silas, his hand holding hers, she looked at the faces around the fire, scarred, weary, but unbreakable. They were no longer defined by the darkness of the mine they had escaped, but by the steady, hopeful light of the home they had built. 3 years after emerging from the darkness of the mine, Josephine Vance stood on a small hill overlooking a valley that pulsed with life. The harsh, unforgiving wilderness that had once been their desperate refuge was now a thriving, bustling settlement. Hope's Landing was no longer just a collection of makeshift shelters, but a proper town, with sturdy log cabins lining a single main street, a plume of smoke rising steadily from the blacksmith's forge, and the cheerful sounds of children's laughter spilling from the open door of a small schoolhouse. The memory of the Blackwood Syndicate had faded into a cautionary tale told around the fire. Their empire of fear, built on a foundation of brutality, had crumbled under its own weight. Its power, broken by the small and defiant acts of communities like this one, which had proven that unity was a force more formidable than any army. Josie, her body full and strong with the new life growing within her, walked through the town with a quiet, confident grace. She was not a baroness ruling from a cold manor, but a leader who knew the names of every child and the worries of every family. Her authority came not from a title, but from the shared memory of hardship and the respect she had earned. She stopped by the communal smokehouse to inspect the winter provisions with Esther, the old woman whose eyes now shone with a fierce, grandmotherly pride. She then spent time at the schoolhouse, where a young woman they had rescued from the mine was now teaching a dozen children how to read and write. Josie watched them, a lump forming in her throat. This was the true victory, not the death of their enemies, but the cultivation of a future where knowledge was a tool for building, not a weapon for control. Silas was no longer the silent, haunted man she had first met. The ghosts of his past had not vanished, but they had found peace, making room for a present filled with purpose. The town looked to him for his wisdom of the land, his steady hand in construction, and his calm judgment. The profound silence that had once been his armor was now a comfortable peace, often broken by a low chuckle as he taught a group of boys how to track a deer or whittle a piece of wood into a perfect soaring hawk. He had healed, and in doing so had become the bedrock upon which much of Hope's Landing was built. Mattie Hayes, her hair now more silver than black, had become the town's matriarch, her porch the unofficial courthouse and confessional, where she dispensed dry, practical advice with a sharp wit and a generous heart. Today, the entire valley was alive with celebration. It was the annual harvest festival, a tradition they had started that first year to mark not just the gathering of crops, but their collective survival. Long trestle tables groaned under the weight of roasted meats, fresh baked bread, pies made from wild berries, and vegetables grown in the rich soil they had tilled together. The air was filled with the lively music of a fiddle and a guitar, played by men who had once known only the sound of pickaxes against rock. People from all walks of life, former ranch hands, freed captives, homesteaders who had sought refuge here, danced together on the flattened earth, their laughter a testament to the community they had become. It was a family, not of blood, but of shared scars and a common, fiercely protected dream. As the afternoon sun began to dip lower, casting a warm, golden glow over the valley, Josie and Silas took a quiet walk up the familiar path to the ledge overlooking their home. From this vantage point, the town below was a perfect tapestry of light, life, and sound. He took her hand, his calloused fingers gently enveloping hers. She leaned her head against his shoulder, a comfortable, practiced gesture of trust and love. For a long time, they stood in silence, not an empty or awkward silence, but one filled with everything that did not need to be said. "I used to read about places like this in my books," Josie said softly, her voice filled with a quiet wonder. "Utopias, sanctuaries. I always thought they were just stories." "They are," Silas replied, his gaze fixed on the town below. "Until someone is brave enough to build one." He turned to her, his eyes holding a depth of love and admiration that still made her heart ache with a sweet, familiar pang. He gently placed his hand on her swollen belly, and at that moment, She felt a strong, definite kick from within. A new generation. A child of hope's landing. A life that would know only this valley. This freedom. She's strong, Silas murmured, a smile touching his lips. She has a good teacher, Josie answered, her own eyes filling with tears of pure, unadulterated joy. She was no longer the Baron's daughter, defined by her father's disappointment and the world's judgment of her appearance. She was not the fugitive fleeing from the past, nor the warrior forged in the dark. She was Josie, a founder, a partner, a mother-to-be. She had not been given this life. She had built it, piece by painful, beautiful piece. The sun finally kissed the horizon, painting the western sky in fiery strokes of orange, pink, and purple. The lights from the cabins below began to twinkle on, small, man-made stars answering the celestial ones appearing above. The sounds of music and laughter drifted up to them on the cool evening breeze. Silas wrapped his arm around her, holding her close. They stood there together, two survivors who had found in each other's broken pieces a love strong enough to build a world. They were home, and in this small, hidden valley, a new kind of West was being born, one founded not on conquest and power, but on resilience, kindness, and the simple, enduring promise that even after the longest, darkest night, the sun will always rise again.